let's talk about recording quality. People are often confused when we run listings looking for vintage music. We'll say even a good quality demo can work. Um, it's hard to explain the difference. I don't know if you're aware of this. I don't know if I've ever told you, but the term broadcast quality didn't really get used in the music industry until I was having a hard time explaining to taxi members back in the early 90s what the difference was between something that might be in a music library versus something that a big artist like Michael Jackson might have done in a 48 track digital studio with a 96 input SSL console in front of him. And I was looking at a like videography magazine one day, and there was a picture of a new Sony, like one of those shoulder mount cameras, and it said broadcast quality. And so I started using that in our listings, and it really did take off in the industry. It's a great way to describe something, and people say to me, well, what does broadcast quality mean? They can't separate the audio quality, audio engineering, and the mix quality from other factors that go into the stew of what determines if something is broadcast quality. Um, so, how would you describe broadcast quality from the vintage music perspective?
So, just like I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an audio engineer, but that's actually, I think, something that has served me sort of well in this endeavor, because things don't need to be perfect. That is one thing to keep in mind. The scratches and pops of, transferred material add character to vintage recordings and tell us that they're vintage. And that's stuff that, those little artifacts are not necessarily things that subtract from the recording. Sometimes those are things that add to the recordings. But specifically to your point, broadcast quality. Let's think about what that could mean. If I'm going to sit here and I'm going to record a demo I'm going to get out my guitar and I'm going to write a song and I'm going to record a demo onto the Notes app on my phone, that's not broadcast quality. But if I have a decent microphone and I run it through a decent program on my laptop, I could make something theoretically that would be able to go into a film or onto a television show by taking a little extra care and going through a few extra steps. And Taxi has a lot of resources, and I've seen that at the Road Rally, and I'm sure you have those online about, digital workstations and things along those lines.
Right.
So if you take that mentality and you go back in time, if you were recording stuff onto dinky little cassette tapes on a Sony Walkman in the mid-early 80s, and you have a recording that is mostly tape hiss with a song buried underneath, there's only so much that can be done to clean it up. That being said, if it's a good song and you can hear it and it's evocative of the era, that would be something that we would certainly consider, because there is character to that. That's also sort of what would be a differentiator between, I never want to disparage any kind of music, but I would just say like cubicle rock, where it could be made to sound old. And so that would be one thing, is going backwards. If you were using like a nicer 4-track Tascam 424 whatever in the 90s and recording that way, and you still have those cassette tapes and you have 4 tracks on those are probably at a point where they could be cleaned up and they could be made to sound exactly how they should. And that would be the kind of thing that, even though in the 90s you thought of that as a demo and you were doing it on the cheap onto a cassette tape you bought, at the drugstore, it could be worth revisiting those cassettes. Going even further back, because recording, the further back in time you go, the more expensive and arduous and difficult recordings were to make. So in the 60s, there's this thing called the Nashville demo, and that's vocal and guitar, and that is so you could hear the song kind of bare bones, and then the songwriters who had contracts with publishers. They would record their Nashville demos on decent microphones in actual studios, the only place you could do the recordings. And vocal, guitar, simple. And then if a publisher liked it, they would take it and they would, give it to a known artist to record with a full band and really produce it, 16 tracks, 24 tracks, etc. Those Nashville demos, to me personally as a music fan, are like gold. As someone who works in vintage music, archival publishing, etc., those songs are broadcast quality because those capture a very special moment in time where the type of song that was written was not usually recorded that way. So if you can find something like that where, we were talking about demos, so that's kind of where we are now. If you have access to songs like that were recorded in that way, those have a whole new lifespan. Those have a whole new outlet, because hearing that stuff is like a trip to a museum, and it can be a very rewarding experience to listen to it, but additionally that can add a lot of flavor and a lot of texture to a project in terms of a visual sense, where it can transport you back to the 60s, it can transport you back to the 70s or 80s. So having some of those artifacts and some of those imperfections do not preclude something from being broadcast quality. All that being said, we do need the songs to be professional. Vocalists always need to be on key, and the chord changes need to be well done, and all of the things that go into like a good song need to be there. But getting super hung up on little details it's a forest from the trees situation. It's not one size fits all. I mean, there's a song from a Taxi writer that we signed that I think actually was recorded on Sony Walkman in the early 90s. There are songs that we've signed from Taxi writers that are actually authentic Nashville demos. And we run the gamut and we make them sound how they are supposed to sound.